Hi, I'm Karen Q, and today we're at the New York Historical Society. Well, at least virtually at the New York Historical Society. During the winter of 2015-2016, I had the pleasure of taking my clients on a tour of a fantastic exhibit they had running called The Battle of Brooklyn, or also called The Battle of Long Island. And in that exhibit, they had some really wonderful stuff from their collection, rare items that are almost never on display. So I thought I would go through all of the pictures I had of that display, of that exhibit, and share them with you in a virtual walking tour of the New York Historical Society's Battle of Brooklyn. I hope you enjoy it. Well, as soon as we enter in through the glass doors and turn right, we're greeted with this incredible display for the Battle of Brooklyn, and in front of it, two life-size statues of Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr recreating their infamous duel of 1804. The statues are remarkable in their detail. They were done in 2004 by artist Kim Crowley and are bronze. And they are really something to see, and they just really are stunning as you walk in. One of the things we notice, though, as we walk through are people asking the staff, why are the statues so small? If they're life-size, why are they so small? And that's because both Hamilton and Burr were average size for their time, about 5'6". Considered, I think, a little small today. Ladies, by the way, were about average at 4'9", and that's why when you go to museums and you see all those beautiful dresses from the 18th century, they look so tiny. So people were quite a bit smaller then. Now, this duel took place in 1804, and that's 28 years after the Battle of Brooklyn, which occurs in 1776. Both men are young and participate in that battle as young officers on the side, of course, of General Washington. So we pass this and turn into the main gallery at the New York Historical Society. And the next thing we see is this. Now, let me remind you that what you're seeing in this video is what the New York Historical Society looked like in the winter of 2015-2016. It no longer looks like this. So although I'm speaking in the present tense, I'm trying to pretend that we're walking through it live right now. So if you were there today, you would not see what we're seeing in this video. So as we pass through the main gallery, all about New York's colonial and Revolutionary War history. And you can see from these two photos I took just a great array of portraits and statues, paintings, and artifacts. I am going to do a video later just of the artifacts in this gallery because I just thought it was so wonderful seeing them all in one place like this that you should have an opportunity to enjoy them. So we pass through this main New York gallery, and we pass through two dark glass doors labeled the Battle of Long Island or the Battle of Brooklyn, and we enter the gallery. And the first item we see is spectacular. It's a version of Paul Revere's etching of the Boston Massacre, and it is a color version of that etching. This is the first time I've ever seen a color version, and it is stunning in its detail. The Boston Massacre took place March 5th, 1770. That's 5 years before the start of the Revolutionary War and 6 years before the Battle of Brooklyn. Now, the Battle of Brooklyn took place from August 22nd to September 16th of 1776. So this depicts an event long before that, but an event that certainly led to that occurrence, right? The Boston Massacre of 1770 really begins laying the groundwork for full rebellion in the colonies, a full 5 years before the war began. Now, this is one of the most important pieces of colonial printing still remaining, one of the most important historic significant pieces, I would say, mainly because Paul Revere did it, but also because of the effect it had on the people of the colonies. When viewing this etching, people truly believed that British forces lined up as you see here and shot into a crowd of innocent men standing on the other side of the road. You even see an innocent dog here watching the proceedings. This, of course, is not at all the way the event happened, but it made people believe it's the way it happened and became one of the most important pieces of colonial propaganda against the British. So our display really starts out with a spectacular item, a color version of Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. Now, the events leading up to the war in New York really heat up in July of 1776 with the destruction of the statue of King George III. And this is one of the New York Historical Society's many depictions of that event. The statue was torn down on July 9th after the Declaration of Independence was read to the people of New York. And if we take a close look at this painting, we see some really interesting things. Although the Sons of Liberty get credit for tearing down the statue, and in particular a guy you may have heard of named Hercules Mulligan, you notice that it's not just kind of rough guys in this picture. To the left are some gentlemen who are standing there discussing what's happening, and on the right are even some ladies and some children. And the left foreground are a few members of the local Lenape tribe. So you can see that many people were there for the tearing down of the statue. And one gentleman in his memoir of the event said he was shocked to see that, well, even ladies were present for this obscene event. Now, not only did the people of the town tear down the statue, they also knocked all of the crown ornaments on the fence, off of the fence that surrounded the statue. And all of that, or I should say most of that, was melted down for musket balls for Washington's army. Now, right nearby this painting, we find a couple of copies of the Declaration of Independence printed here in New York. And I'd first like to apologize to you for a lot of the glare you're going to see in these photos. Many of these documents are of extremely high value and, of course, were in secure glass cases. And, you know, I'm sure you've all seen these cases. It's almost impossible to not get glare in your photographs of the items inside of them. So this is a copy of New York's John Holt's, I should say, New York Journal or General Advertiser. It was published on July 11th and is an original copy of the Declaration, as you can see there on the right. John Holt is known as the Patriot or Liberty Printer of New York. He is what you would call a Whig or a rebel, and he is known for printing all sorts of stuff in opposition to the crown. And so he printed the Declaration of Independence you see here. One of the things I wonder when I look at this copy is, look at the perfect condition this is in. I can't even imagine the value of this issue of this newspaper being the Declaration of Independence printed by John Holt and in mint condition like this. In the next case, we find another copy of the Declaration, this one printed by Hugh Gain, another New York printer. And Hugh Gain more often would be associated with Tories or loyalists of that time. So it would be more of a loyalist type of printer, although not 100%. Of course, even the loyalist printers would have printed the Declaration of Independence, it being such a significant document. So here we have on display two original copies of the Declaration as it was printed in the city of New York. Of course, you know the very original copies were printed in Philadelphia. So these are original New York copies. Also on display are some of the remnants of the statue of King George III. On the left is the tail of the horse, and on the right is a piece of the saddle. Now, I mentioned that most of the statue and the ornaments were melted for musket balls, but a few pieces do remain, and it's thought that there are some additional pieces in private collections here and in England, and especially the head of the statue, which the rebels in New York put on display on the end of a stick. And that head was eventually sent to England by British Captain John Montresor in order to preserve it. So that head must exist somewhere in a collection in England, the head of the statue of King George III. But these are the two pieces we have here in New York, the tail of the horse and the saddle. Now, of course, a lot of things got people wound up that year, 1776, and one of those was Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. And here is an original copy printed in New York Again, the original copies were printed in Philadelphia. This is an original printed in New York, printed by John Anderson. And I think this was so popular that Anderson printed a second run of it. So Thomas Paine's Common Sense, encouraging the people of the colonies that it was only common sense to break off our ties with England. So an original copy of his great pamphlet here. I don't have a picture of it here for you, but this exhibit also includes a copy of his famous The American Crisis #1, issued in December 1776, the one you know that starts, "These are the times that try men's souls." So both of those are on exhibit in this display. This one is Common Sense, the first one. Now let's have a look at who was key in the Revolutionary War on the British side. So here we have 5 people. Frederick North and George Germain would be known as Tories. North was the prime minister during the war, and George Germain was the minister of war. The Tories were the faction in the British Parliament that supported war against the colonies. On the other side, we have Edmund Burke, Charles James Fox, and William Pitt the Elder, Whig members of Parliament. And the Whigs are the gentlemen who largely supported the colonies. William Pitt also served for a time as various ministers, and he served as prime minister. Many of you might know Edmund Burke as a great philosopher and legal thinker of his time. The Whigs in England believed that the colonies were a part of Britain, and as such deserved full and equal protection under the law, that we deserve the same rights and privileges as British subjects. That meaning that the arguments we had about the way England was treating us ought to be resolved in the Parliament and in the courts through the legal process, and not by occupation of British forces. And the Whigs warned that that occupation was destined to go wrong and cause a war that Britain would surely use. Now, George Germain served as Minister of War during at least the first part of the American Revolution. I'm not sure if he served for all of it, but he was the Minister of War during the Battle of Long Island, or the Battle of Brooklyn, and the overall battle for New York. George Germain had a great plan for New York. His idea was to begin massing the Army and Navy at New York and draw in all of the American forces, which were spread out and not very strong. His view was that if the British could lure Washington and all of the forces, the Continental forces and the militias and the riflemen and everyone into New York, that the British could then use their superior army and most key naval forces to destroy Washington at New York. Minister Germain felt that it was important that the Americans be defeated quickly in 1776 in New York. His fear was that if they were not, any remnant that remained would make its way back out into the colonies, where it would grow and ultimately be impossible to defeat. His view was that the colonies were so vast and that the English were not skilled in finding their way around. They would also not know who to trust. They would not know who was helping them or who was hindering them in their advances. And so his view was that the Americans needed to be smashed in New York, and he provided all of the tools with which to make that happen. And next we have one of John Trumbull's portraits of General Washington. You've seen many of John Trumbull's portraits of all of the officers of the American Revolution. So here's just one of the few portraits in this exhibit of General Washington that are on display for you to see. Now next, let's take a look at the officers who will be involved in the Battle of Brooklyn. On the left, we have Washington's officers, and I think most key to the Battle of Brooklyn are going to be William Alexander Lord Sterling, John Sullivan, and Israel Putnam. Now, when the Battle of Brooklyn began on August 22nd, the Americans were taken off guard. British forces were on Staten Island, and everyone expected them to come to Manhattan Island and begin the battle. So Brooklyn was only partially fortified against an attack. When the British landed in Brooklyn on August 22nd, the Americans scrambled to get enough forces over there to fight them, and they were not successful. Both Sterling and Sullivan were taken prisoner in the Battle of Brooklyn. Israel Putnam continued to command, survived the Battle of Brooklyn, and continued to command throughout the rest of the Battle of New York. And I'm not going to talk too much about the other two, especially Charles Lee. On the British side, we have two gentlemen you've probably heard of, Sir William Howe and Lord Richard Howe. Sir William Howe commanding the Army and Lord Richard Howe commanding the Navy. I mentioned that Minister Germain sent all of the forces necessary to achieve his goals in New York. He sent a massive army deployment under command of General Howe and a huge naval deployment under command of Admiral Howe. So all of these forces came into New York, and two of the commanders under William Howe you have also probably heard of, General Henry Clinton and General Charles Cornwallis. Now, Clinton, Cornwallis, and the younger Howe were notorious for not getting along with each other. Henry Clinton, early in the battle for New York, instructed General Howe to surround Manhattan Island with naval forces and to place military on the only footbridge leading off of the island, the Kingsbridge Crossing at the very northern end of Manhattan. And William Howe, not liking Henry Clinton, finding him an annoying person, didn't listen to him. And toward the end of 1776, that is exactly the way General Washington's army will make its retreat from the island over the Kingsbridge Crossing. So it might have been good for William Howe to listen to Sir Henry Clinton. And you may also know that Sir Clinton and Cornwallis also did not get along with each other. So these are the major commanders in the Battle of Brooklyn. Now, during the summer of 1776, as forces, both American and British, were massing in New York, the British Navy decided to test Washington's fortifications along the Hudson River side of the island. And they sent two warships, the Phoenix and the Rose, from New York Harbor up to about where the George Washington Bridge is today and back down to the harbor to see how well fortified the island was. And it is a sad story that Washington's men were so inept at manning the cannon along the Hudson River that they didn't hit either of the ships. At one point, eyewitnesses said that the British sailors came out on the decks of the ships and even laughed at and taunted the Americans. And this painting depicts the Phoenix and the Rose being fired upon as they've passed some of those fortifications in Upper Manhattan on the Hudson River. Now, nearby, we find some examples of uniforms, and these are actually two very nice uniforms, a British uniform, an American uniform, and a man's tunic or shirt. And remember, all clothing at that time was hand sewn. Most soldiers carried with them a sewing kit and did their own repairs on their clothing. Of course, the British officers were aristocrats and also traveled with servants who, did their work for them. But most Americans wound up sewing and repairing their own uniforms. If you go to a reenactment sometime, ask one of the soldiers to show you his sewing kit, and he'll show it to you. Reenactors will all be carrying them, and they'll explain to you how they have to repair their own garments, as often those are the only set of garments a man has, the ones he is wearing. So these are some very nice garments on display. Now, not all of the men who fought on the American side had nice uniforms to wear. Most of the men showed up wearing whatever they owned. And here is a drawing on display showing us the various depictions of American soldiers as they arrived to fight. And you can see there's a lot of disparity. And there's even more than this. I have a large picture book here showing all of the different uniforms of the American Revolution. So as I mentioned, many of the men who were not officers, who were just fighters or riflemen, soldiers, fought in whatever clothing they owned. And often that was the only clothing they had for the entire time that they fought. So they had to repair it and wash it and take care of it. So this just shows a few of the different ways American soldiers appeared. And right nearby, I think this is one of the most interesting things on display. I really enjoy this. A little book of music that would have been carried by a soldier, and a drum. The drum to me is fascinating. I never had any idea that the canvas on the drum was painted in any way. And this is a beautifully preserved drum. You can still see the painting intact on the side of it. And I thought this is just a really, really lovely display. On the other side of the drum, you can see kind of a flat object there. And if we walk over and take a look at that, we see that it is General Washington's cot and tent. So we think, well, the general must have had nice accommodations, didn't he? No, he did not. But by other standards, these are very luxurious compared to the average American soldier who slept on the ground out in the open, or maybe in a lean-to he would build with a couple other guys, or maybe, a homemade tent of some sort that they might have to cover them. So this is really comfortable compared to what your average soldier had to sleep on. And this doesn't look too great to me, but this was the general's cot, which is in the permanent collection of the New York Historical Society. They had it out last summer as well. So here we have General Washington's cot. And what is an exhibit about the American Revolution without some weapons? So here we have a musket and a bayonet on display. Now, I don't know if many of you have seen an actual 18th century musket and bayonet. I have, and I have to say, the first time I saw one, I was shocked at how long it is. I'm 5'2" in my bare feet. It was almost as tall as me, and with the bayonet attached, it was taller than me and heavy. And remember, every soldier not only carried all of his supplies, he carried his weapon and ammunition and the bayonet as well. So your average soldier was carrying quite a lot with him, and he walked everywhere. They weren't all up nicely up on horseback. The average soldier walked from battle to battle, carrying all of his belongings and necessities. So here's the musket and bayonet, and here is a bayonet. Now, if you've never seen a bayonet is not flat like a sword or a knife. It's three-sided, and it makes a hole in its victim that is impossible to repair in 18th century medicine. In the Battle of Brooklyn, Americans would have been terrified of the British soldiers' bayonets. Americans had not yet learned to fight with bayonets or to maneuver against the bayonets. So the bayonet would have been a frightening thing for them to be facing that summer with the British and the Hessians carrying them. So there's a bayonet. Now the exhibit also has a wonderful collection of original documents and letters. And here is a letter written by a Connecticut officer, William Douglas, to his wife, Hannah. It was written on August 10th, 1776. So this is just under 2 weeks before the battle began. So this would have been written when the American soldiers are massed and the British are massed, and everybody is waiting to see who is going to make the first move, starting the battle for New York. And Mr. Douglas often wrote to his wife about day-to-day events in his life as a soldier. And in this letter, he describes the journey of the Phoenix and the Rose up the Hudson and back, and how unskilled Washington's artillerists were, and really what a shameful event it was for the Americans. He also tells his wife that there are rumors that the British planned to burn the city in order to get Washington's army out of it. Rumors of burning New York persisted on both sides, and New York is eventually going to be burned in 1776, and we'll get to that in a little while. One of the things I always notice about letters written during this time is the beautiful penmanship. And very few corrected mistakes in the letter. So you can see that people wrote very carefully. They thought about what they were going to say, and they took their time writing these letters. So a beautiful letter on display, Officer William Douglas to his wife Hannah in Connecticut. And a proclamation. This is our last royal governor of New York, William Tryin, and this is a proclamation he placed on behalf of the king, telling the rebels, or we might today call them patriots, of New York to give up. If you switch your loyalties now and come back to the king, you will be forgiven for all you've done up until this point. If you remain in rebellion, though, you will be severely punished. Now, I think we should note that when Governor Tryin issued this proclamation, he was living on a ship in New York Harbor called the Duchess of Gordon. And that ship was anchored to an island then called Bedloe's Island that you know as Liberty Island. Why was the governor of New York living out on a ship in the harbor? Well, he lived there for 18 months from Lexington and Concord through the fall of 1776 because rebels had taken over the island and it was not safe for him to remain. So he governed from a ship in the harbor. He wasn't the only governor of New York in 1776. We also had Governor George Clinton, who was the provincial or rebel governor of the colony. So here we have a proclamation from William Tryon: "Come back to the king now, and all will be forgiven." And what are proclamations, if not one from His Excellency himself, Commander-in-Chief General George Washington? This was issued on August 17th, and it orders the people of New York to evacuate the city, evacuate Lower Manhattan. He says an attack is imminent. He encourages everyone to leave the city, and he also, in the proclamation, says arrangements must be made for the poor, for the infirm, for the sick and invalids and elderly to be brought out of the city as well. And most civilians did flee the city before the battle started. People went to Long Island, they went to New England, they went up into the Hudson Valley and to New Jersey. People panicked. Many left their belongings right on the docks and got out of New York as quickly as they could. So this is the evacuation order issued by General Washington just before the fighting began. And next are a couple orderly books. Orderly books are the day-to-day books kept by officers. And these orderly books are of particular interest to me because they were kept by General Alexander McDougall. Alexander McDougall is one of the larger-than-life characters from Revolutionary War New York City. He was a Scottish immigrant. He came when he was a child. He became a ship captain and a merchant. He's mostly known as Captain McDougall's from his shipping days. He became a successful merchant himself. He was a founder and leader of the New York Sons of Liberty, and of course, an officer in the Revolutionary War. So for me, it's really a thrill to see these books kept by Alexander McDougall himself. After the war, McDougall became a founder of the Bank of New York with his friend Alexander Hamilton, and I think he lived to be about 82, and he is buried in New York City at 5th Avenue and 12th Street at the Presbyterian Church there. So a great part of this exhibit, the orderly books of General Alexander McDougall. And of course, the British had orderly books as well, and this is one kept by the British Brigade of Foot Guards, and it covers August 14th of 76 to January 29th of 77. So a little bit of a different format, but the same idea, the day-to-day activities of that brigade. And how about some New York money? Here we have some money printed and what do I want to say? And supported by the government of New York. This is worth 5 Spanish mill dollars, or the value equivalent in gold or silver, according to the Convention of New York, August 1776. On the right, the symbol that you see is the arms of the city of New York, and that still is the arms of the city of New York. So if you look at our New York City flag, you'll see that same symbol there. And 'tis death to counterfeit. In other words, counterfeiting is punishable by death. Counterfeiting was rampant during the Revolutionary War, and so much American currency was successfully counterfeited by the British that these currencies became worthless. Even if they weren't counterfeited, it is unlikely that any of the states had any money to pay off these notes. So this is one of those 5-pound notes issued by the government of New York in 1776. Now, ultimately, Washington will be driven out of Brooklyn. He'll cross over to Manhattan, and in a series of battles, he will also be driven off the island of Manhattan. In September of 1776, September 21st to be exact, the British will come in and take control of the island of Manhattan. They will hold it for 7 years until November of 1783. The island will be under full occupation, and it will also be the command center for the rest of the war for the British. Now, during that time, this little play was written, The Battle of Brooklyn, a farce of 2 acts, and it was published by James Rivington, the printer, and it is reportedly written by the British General John Burgoyne. Now, some of you might know that the Americans made fun of Burgoyne and they called him Gentleman Johnny because John Burgoyne, being an aristocrat, stopped for tea every day when he was on the road. Not just simple tea, but formal tea, during which his servants got out a table, spread it with linens, got out the silver and china service, and conducted formal tea every afternoon for General Burgoyne. So John Burgoyne was jokingly called Gentleman Johnny. He also was known as writing for the theater and performing in the theater, and he wrote this little play. The play depicts the Battle of Brooklyn and the American officers all being cowards and drunks. It shows the servants of Generals Sterling and Sullivan as dishonest and scheming and eventually deserting to the British side. So this is the farce, Battle of Brooklyn, a farce in 2 acts, published in the fall of 1776 by James Rivington, the printer. Now, when the British took the city on September 21st, 1776, a raging fire burned about a quarter of the city. And this map shows the city after the fire. So that smudged out area you're looking at depicts where the fire burned. It started on the lower part of the map toward New York Harbor. It burned up to the Broadway, which is that wide street you see running along through the town, and up along the Hudson River side. It stopped near King's College and St. Paul's Chapel. You can also see on the map on the lower left, Fort George is still intact, and that little circular object is the Bowling Green, where the statue of the king was torn down. Now, during the 7 years of occupation, the British made no effort to repair any of this. And in the lower part of the burnt-out area, this was called the Canvas Town, and the town's poorest people lived there in the burnt-out ruins, many of them covered only by canvas for protection. The other side of the burnt-out area along the Hudson River, where you see the ships, was called the Holy Ground. And the Holy Ground consisted primarily of brothels, gambling houses, and taverns. New York City after the Great Fire of 1776, as it existed during the British occupation. And after the war, of course, New York had to rebuild all of the damage done by this fire. Right after the fire, the commander of New York, James Robertson, British Major General, issued this proclamation telling everyone living in the town that because of the arsonists in the town, now the British believed the fire was set by arsonists, although it was not. It was an accidental fire. They even executed people they claimed to have been arsonists. So General Robertson says because of the arson that has just taken place in the town, anyone living in the town who receives visitors must register those visitors and keep track of everywhere they go, the dates, the times, and when they leave. And this will stay in effect throughout the 7 years of occupation, that if you receive a visitor from outside of the island, you must register and keep track of that visitor in an effort to cut down on spies and terrorists coming into the town. So this is that proclamation by Major General Robertson. Now, the next thing on display is one of my favorite things, and it's so old and faded, you can barely see it, but what you can still see are some of the signatures on this document. Now, Although we all think of everybody being patriots during the American Revolution, that certainly wasn't true. And it really wasn't true in New York, where about half of the population remained loyal to the king. This is a document, a petition signed by 547 New York loyalists supporting the crown and the parliament. It was issued on November 28th of 1776, and I think it's just an incredible document. One of the greatest things in the collection, in my opinion, and because you can still see many of these original men's signatures on this document proclaiming their loyalty to the crown. And what would an exhibit be without James Rivington's New York Loyal Gazette, which eventually turned into the New York Royal Gazette. James Rivington, throughout the occupation, will be the official crown printer in New York City. Some of you might know him from the AMC TV series Turn, Washington Spies. He also ran a coffee house for British officers, and this is what his newspaper, the Loyal Gazette, looked like. The Loyal Gazette is great to read, first because it gives you a lot of information about what's going on in New York and what's going on with the command and the people in New York, what kinds of things are being imported into New York, what you can buy, what's scarce, things like that. But it also is filled with incredible propaganda about the Americans, that they're losing every battle, that they're absolutely inept, that Washington's army is deserting him. And in one issue, a great little article claiming that Benjamin Franklin had been beaten almost to death on a road outside of Paris, France. So James Rivington's wonderful Loyal Gazette. Now, also on display as a smaller display within the Battle of New York or Battle of Brooklyn display is a display about the Jersey prison ship. During the American Revolution, the British kept a series of 5 ships docked in Brooklyn for prisoners of war and other types of prisoners, people convicted of crimes, people thought of as spies, and under other undesirables. And this model shows the decks of the Jersey, which was the most notorious of these ships, and how crowded the decks were. One of the men who survived the Jersey, most did not, but one of the men who survived was a Captain Thomas Dring. And in his memoir, he says that one of the ways he survived was that in the mornings he would volunteer to throw the bodies of those who died the night before off of the deck. He said this would get him out of the putrid deck he was forced to live on and get him some fresh air. Now, about 11,000 people were thought to have died on those ships and their bodies deposited into the East River. This exhibit shows more views of the Jersey and another jail, the Sugar House. Up on the top is a depiction of the Sugar House, and if you know where Trinity Church is today, that would be toward the rear of the Trinity Church graveyard as it exists today. The etching shows the misery that the men encountered on the Jersey prison ship. To the right of that is a piece of wood from the Jersey, and far to the right is a cane that was later made from some of the wood of the Jersey. Eventually, the bodies of the people thrown from those ships into the East River were recovered, and they were interred in Brooklyn at Fort Greene Park under the monument you see in the picture at the top. So all of the remains eventually got a proper burial, a respectful, proper burial. The monument on top of the tomb has an eternal flame that burns in it. And it is a very nice park to visit. I highly recommend, if you're in Brooklyn, visiting Fort Greene Park. It's a very nice place to go and to pay your respects to the men who died on those prison ships. I mentioned it was estimated 11,000 died. When you look at the Sugar House on the top, there were other jails in New York City as well. And I think it's estimated that about 4,000 died on those ships, bringing the total to about 15,000 who died only in New York City as prisoners of the British. And as we walk out of the exhibit, we go back into the main gallery, and the last thing we see is a life-size reproduction of the first submarine, the Bushnell Turtle, used in the summer of 1776. This is a one-man pilotable submarine, and it was used in an attempt to blow up the flagship of the British fleet, Admiral Lord Howe's Eagle. The attempt failed, but it was the first successful voyage of a submarine, the Bushnell Turtle, made by the Bushnell brothers of Connecticut. And then we turn right and we exit out of the main doors and back out onto the street. So that concludes our walk through the New York Historical Society exhibit, The Battle of Brooklyn, or The Battle of Long Island. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to my channel so you'll find out when I release new videos. And if you know someone who would enjoy seeing this, please share it with your friends. Until next time, I'm Karen Q.